Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Meet the Author with Anders Morley. I'm Christine Catallo. I'm the Chief Librarian at Pequot Library here in Southport, Connecticut. Tonight, we're in for a wonderful talk with Anders, who is the author of the memoir, This Land of Snow, which follows his harrowing year traveling across the Canadian winter alone on his cross-country skis. A dual citizen of the US and Canada, Anders grew up in New Hampshire and began skiing at age 5. After earning a master's degree from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, he settled in Italy, where he worked as a translator and English teacher and explored the Alps in his free time. He contributes regularly to New Hampshire Magazine, and his work has appeared in a variety of other publications, including the Globe and Mail, Northern Woodlands Magazine, Maisonneuve Magazine, and the Aurorean. Morley lives in northern New Hampshire. Tonight, Anders will be in conversation with Jesse Levin and Sefra Levin, who are dedicated members of the Pequot Library family and seasoned adventurers themselves. Sefra and Jesse are the founders of the Readiness Collective, which reimagines society's relationship with survival and emergency preparedness, and they have undertaken many efforts to promote readiness and improve our relationship with natural ecosystems. So now I'll hand things over to Sefra and Jesse.
Thank you for having us, guys. It's a pleasure and an honor to be able to kind of host and speak to such an incredible author. So, Anders, Steph, if you want to chime in, we first spoke and we read the book yet, and we had all some commonalities. We've all spent a good deal of time in the woods and appreciating nature. But after kind of jumping into this, the way you've articulated. You've combined this idea of adventure. It's almost an adventure self-help book, philosophical guide. And when you look at it, you think, oh, this is just another story about grit and, an explorer, but it was just phenomenally much more diverse than that. And I'm really looking forward to kind of picking your brain and digging into some of these passages.
Thanks very much, Jesse. I'm looking forward to it too. And thanks to the Pequot Library, I should say, just before we get started, and to the two of you for taking the time to do this. And I'm looking forward to talking about it. I'm glad that you mentioned that at the start. As I said just a minute ago, one of my concerns is that people might see the book and just think it's a book about cross-country skiing, that it's the kind of thing that would only interest people who are cross-country skiers themselves. But I've tried to do something a lot more multifaceted than that, and to make an interesting book for armchair travelers who are thoughtful, so thanks for that.
Yeah, I think you did such a wonderful job. Even more than like the technical side of what it takes to actually survive and go through that, it was so much more about the vignettes of the people that you met, and it just really highlighted into these great characters. And for those of us that have traveled, it's such a great reminder of those lives that you kind of dip into. And I especially liked with the camaraderie factor of, I also tumbled down Tuckerman's Ravine, the top part of it. So when I heard that first part, I said, not alone. So it's nice to the Northeast roots here.
So I think we'll just jump in, and maybe we can assume. I think this conversation will be relevant for folks who both have and have not read the book. But definitely encourage folks to dive in if they haven't. And one thing we were discussing earlier, on your adventure is, how you describe the trail system, right? There's, you spend a lot of time both kind of slogging through on road, off road, tugging the sled, around, but you really beautifully kind of synthesize your appreciation for trails, right? And you kind of equated them to society, and you came at it from a bunch of different angles, but there's a couple different sides of this. One thing that I would love when you talked about this is, I think it was one of the loggers, or it might have been one of the indigenous folks up there you ran into, but he had the quote, "When trails stop getting used, roads grow in," right? And that kind of gets to your point on all this infrastructure and technological advancement that affords us all of this ease of life, and this is what we've kind of put forth as like the great pinnacle to get more and more efficient, almost makes us more frenetic. And how trails and their simplicity, they arise and they kind of arrive when needed, and they're built by a collective. All the animals work together and traverse the land in the most natural way. which you got to take advantage of as kind of part of that community when you're immersed in nature. But how you correlated that just to society and infrastructure was really fascinating.
Thanks. Yeah, so I talk about trails very, very broadly in that chapter that you're talking about. You know, when we use the word trails, we often think of just, you know, footpaths like the Appalachian Trail and so forth, which those are all trails, of course. But you know, there are other ways of moving across trails. There are trails that exist only in the wintertime, winter trails that depend on the weather, you know, snow or ice. And lakes, for example, become usable as ski trails in the wintertime, but then in the summer they're gone. But then they're usable by canoes in slightly different ways. So trails are, I think one of the big differences between trails and roads, touching on that quote that you mentioned, is the trails are like roads, obviously, in that they convey us across landscapes and take us places we need to go and connect us to other human beings or other human communities. But it seemed, for me, what a trail is, as opposed to a road, is something that does so in a way that's more respectful of the environment, rather than just sort of, you know, steamrolling it. One thing about a trail, I think, is that, and I don't know whether I say this clearly in the book, but a trail, you know, if it's the more it's used, the better it becomes. Whereas a road, you know, it kind of falls apart. And that, I think that speaks in some way to, I don't know exactly what it speaks to, but there's something nice about that trails, when they're used by human beings who are connecting to other human beings, become better. And they seek out, like I do, one thing I do mention is that the trails they're much more amenable to improvement, like kind of as they're being used. Like if there's an obstacle or something in a trail, people pretty quickly will find a way around it, and a new trail will form. I mean, with a road, if there's an obstacle, the road is out of commission.
Well, I think that you said it so beautifully. You know, trails guide you, but still leave you with that sense of freedom, right? They have that meandering path that, you know, I think the greatest part about, and maybe if the attendees know how to do it, they can raise their hands if they've read the book yet, or if they're excited to read it. But I think, you know, as a member of the Explorers Club and all of these different people who go on expeditions, it's so amazing that you can just put your finger on 2 points on the globe and then just say, okay, it has to be possible to go from here to here, right? And you talk about that harmony and that synthesis and that locomotion of the trail. So, you know, I'm sure there was so much planning that went up to this. And so when you first thought about that, there's no guidebooks, right, that tell you all the trails that intermix. So there's a lot of research and things that go into it, and thus, you know, the story unfolds, right?
Yeah. No, there was certainly a lot of research, a lot of time looking at maps, like at Canadian Geological Survey maps, and Google Maps, which at the time to me was a new technology. And so it was really that was really fun, actually, just patching to looking for, you know, things that humans have made on the landscape, or sometimes that haven't been made by humans, that could be used as trails. It was really, I mean, I was very much an opportunist about it. I wasn't like a purist, you know, I'm only going to ski on foot trails. You know, I used lots of logging roads, for example, as you know, in British Columbia, for example. In Alberta, I even skied for a couple hundred miles probably, along the railroad, which sounds funny to people in the Northeast. But in Canada, you know, the railroad often traverses places where there are no automobile roads for many hundreds of miles sometimes. You know, it's just kind of, the railroad is taking the fastest way, the most direct route between one town and another. And if that route is across the wilderness, that's the way it goes. And so, you know, the line was very useful to me. That line cut through the woods. And so I used it. And not surprisingly, perhaps that's where I saw, like, there at one point I just kept seeing moose after moose after moose, hundreds of, probably over the course of the winter, in British Columbia, all along the railroad, because the trail becomes, I mean, the railroad is for them, it's like, an easy way to move through the.
Yeah, nature likes the path of least resistance, right?
Exactly.
And then, but I mean, but as you've said, the trail in use is thus an eloquent manifestation of the tensions between free will and fate that drives history, right? And this was driving your history.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's too early on, but in case some of the folks out there haven't read your book, maybe want to read just a brief little snippet of that trail section so they can kind of get a delightful flavor of your cadence of eloquence here.
Thank you. So that little bit that you read about this eloquent manifestation of history and free will. Of course, there I'm talking about trails like more ideally. I'm not thinking of this as a railroad track, but just to make that clear for people who don't have the context. But I'll read a little bit of that chapter. Trails, excuse me, trails are good infrastructure and so fundamental that even animals use them. Anyone who walks in the woods will easily notice these so-called game trails as soon as their eyes begin to shed their anthropocentric lenses. In the wintertime, deer and moose create yards, which are essentially circumscribed networks of paths, so that they can move about and access browse without each having to break its own trail. I had begun to learn on my journey that I too needed some kind of trail in the snow to cover any great distance on my skis with my heavy load behind me. This should have come as no surprise, for I've been a user of trails all my life. The mythical ideal of self-sufficiency that had grown in my consciousness during my years in Europe, in reaction to a sense of claustrophobia, began not only to fade, but to look downright dangerous. I started to realize that there was only a short step between the idealization of independence and misanthropy. But I still believed in the value of simplicity and lightness. Perhaps one of the virtues underlying a simple kind of infrastructure, like a trail, is its impermanence, or rather its ability to impinge on the physical universe only when it is needed, and then to fade into a near invisibility. These are really two separate things. In one sense, a trail has a lightness to it such that if it's not used for a time, it will grow over or be snowed in the case of a winter trail, and be swallowed up by the landscape. In the other sense, even when a trail is still used regularly, in the intervals between uses, whether those intervals last hours or days or weeks, it has a way of blending into the background so that life around it can go on without distraction. But so many of our infrastructures, when they're unused and eventually abandoned, persist as scars that clutter the landscape and perhaps, by their presence in our mindscape, detract from our ability to think in closer harmony with our natural environment.
I think that, and I don't like too much of a leap here, but throughout this whole journey, you kind of correlated to your relationship with your wife, and I guess halfway through the book, your ex-wife, and at some point, I forget the character, they said, and I'm paraphrasing, like, you can't live a life chasing true love. You've got to live a life that you love living, and true love will find you, right? And so as you're walking these trails and traversing these trails, and you're very fluid with it, like you've got some sense of an idea, but you might get a tip from this logger or that snowmobiler or that fisherman, which really changed the trajectory of your journey, which I would very much parallel to how you were navigating your relationship and processing those emotions while you're out there. I don't know if that's too much of a leap, but that's kind of what I took.
It's not too much of a leap at all. But there's an unexpected turn as well at the end of the book. But it's interesting, like the focus. It's interesting how we can kind of reinterpret things. The same facts as time goes on, I guess. And so I was constantly having to look for ways across the landscape and to make adjustments and whatnot, like you're saying. But then there's this realization, which I mentioned in that paragraph that I read, that if I didn't have trails of some kind, there was no way that I would have made significant progress across the landscape. Like the few times when I have a trail that's completely snowed in, for example, and they're like 3 feet of unbroken snow, I find myself moving like 2 miles a day completely impracticable for traveling long distances. And so even though when I hatched the idea of going on this journey, it was supposed to be this sort of wilderness experience, at least on some level, and self-reliance was central to it. I realized how important the trails were. And then as far as telling the personal story goes and kind of connecting it to the facts of the journey, the trail, so this idea of trails as this thing that's passed from down through time, from human to human, kind of is a stand-in for traditions in general. But lots of our traditions, of course, are like kind of fossilized, and so we use traditional sometimes as almost as a slur. But the thing about traditions is that they're very adaptable, right? And so ultimately, this is kind of a spoiler, but the book has kind of a happy ending in that I eventually, after a 5-year separation, got back together with my wife. And so marriage is this instance of a tradition that is sometimes a bit inflexible, and so sometimes people feel trapped by it. But my wife and I ultimately were able to kind of to stay married, and so to be inside this institution of marriage, but to kind of find our own kind of bizarre interpretation of it. And what that means is I live in New Hampshire and my wife lives in Italy. And I go there like 3 or 4 months a year, and she comes over here when she can. And so we spend half our time together. But we've both found that there's something that, I don't know, gives us some kind of strength, just this fact of being bound together by this tradition, really. And so trails are kind of like that. They're these things that are amenable to our needs. Yeah.
I think you say it well, between the concrete reality of place and the abstract reality of invention.
Yeah.
So, and I just think in terms of tradition, you also in the book reference the Aboriginal songlines, right? And the Aboriginal peoples, they have this tradition, or they have this skill set. They're some of the greatest trackers that there are, that once someone has walked on the land, those spirit tracks are able to be seen or told by those who can see them. And whether or not that's something that resonates to you, that's a deep part of their tradition and a skill set that they have. And the songlining is that they're able to tell people navigational instruction by singing the songs of place. And so I just wonder, as you tell the story as clean as your 2 skis cutting through it, what your song will sound like, Anders, to tell people to follow your trail.
Man, this guy needs a better map.
I don't know. I guess the book is my song.
Good point.
No, but I'm glad you mentioned that. I do talk in that same chapter. I do touch briefly on the song lines, and what I think is, I mean, from my perspective, what's so wonderful. One of the things, there are many wonderful things about them, but one of them is that it's kind of it's this fusion of trails and language kind of working together. Like the trails don't even need to be like these beaten tracks. Like when you think of trails, we basically think of this track that's been beaten by feet and maybe hundreds of feet over time. There, it's like the trails. I mean, there may be that too, but it's kind of this invisible thing. In the landmarks are carried around in the minds of the people who are responsible for that part of the trail. And what they have to do is to kind of give other people who want to traverse that part of land, like the cues, using language. And of course, language is another one of those great human inventions. And so I just love this idea of the 2 things working together. And because that's the essence of, I talked about the lightness of trails compared to roads, for example. And like what trail could be lighter than that? It's a trail that doesn't even, it exists, you carry it around with you in your mind.
I want to riff on that for a second, and things that working together, and you kept talking about, as you come into a town, right, or over a pass, and you really had an appreciation for like the old loggers cabins, right? Or structures that were not an affront to nature. And, you know, this is the idea of like kind of coexisting and people who are closer to the land, right? And then you kind of come in, and then in the next turn, you are, you know, experiencing like this complete extractive practices, you know, and like this savage logging that's going on, and you know, but meeting these people who, you know, folks might have like a preconceived notion, like, you know, rough redneck loggers in the middle of Canada, you know, just going out and excuse my language, which is like pillaging the land, you know, and extracting all these resources, which we all you know, need. But what was interesting is you know, you kind of got past that, and you found incredible camaraderie, right, and care, and like this like almost guerrilla network of these guys who were driving these logging trucks, you know, in the middle of nowhere, where they're their only lifeline, stopping in and checking in on you and making sure you were getting from point A to point B and leaving you, you know, food, you know. And what I took from that, and, you know, my world in disaster response, we often have these preconceived notions of people or other cultures. And a lot of times, you know, for the most part, people are really good. You know, they're just they're good-hearted, they're well-intentioned, and it's oftentimes the system that is broken, and the function that they are performing is almost a fault of the systemic breakdown in systems that we're all a part of, not a fault of the individual. And I really appreciated how you kind of celebrated, you know, the caring nature and hospitality of a community we all might not particularly think fondly of.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you read it that way. I mean, that was certainly my intention. Yeah, of course. I mean, we all know that human beings are complex, and we're mixes of good things and bad things. But it's easy to forget, and I think, you know, it's easier to understand the world by just schematizing it. And at, you know, at some level, we of course have to do that, because there's so much data to process. But I think that's one of the nice things about travel writing, is that you have a chance to go down to this sort of I guess granular level. Sorry, I'm using like these buzzwords. But yeah, to understand people as individuals and see that they have these reservoirs of warmth in them. Often, you know, people who are, and, you know, you said, you know, redneck loggers. I mean, and these guys were redneck loggers, and they fit all the stereotypes of the redneck logger. But at the same time, you know, they had this like soft, tender side, which is moving. And it was kind of, I mean, it was kind of funny too. It's like to be on the receiving end of that kind of thing. Because, you know, like in the next sentence, they can come out with some total redneck, you know, line that you'd expect them to say. And then there was the one logger, this tough guy, whose nickname is Mudgy in the book. And he was sort of this silent guy, and he's always getting in fights with other loggers in the logging camp. But he was like really concerned about my safety, but he couldn't say it himself, so he was like, had insisted to his colleague, this other logger, to like make sure that I called when I got there to the next town, which is really funny. But there's this sweetness to it as well. I mean, sweet, of course, is the last word you would generally apply to a logger.
I think it really speaks to what I witnessed with you, or at least the way that you write, is like your deep listening, right? I mean, in terms of dialogue, you're not saying much during a lot of the book. You're really listening and just interacting, and then kind of interjecting a few times. And it really just goes to show you the art of deep listening, especially when you're traveling, right? And you use that word diachronically, which I actually had to look up, right? But it's but just thinking about those people that you meet along the way, and that path still exists, and all those people that are still meeting each other in the past and in the future. And it's just it's like this beautiful symphony of humanity, and just kind of getting to walk along the game trails of society, right? And I thought, I loved Mudgy. He was one of my favorite characters.
He's one of mine too.
He
All
was,
three of those guys.
yeah.
They were hilarious. No, thank you for that. That was a wonderful compliment to hear. I'm glad that was the effect.
And you know, along those lines too, like one thing that was kind of most touching, I think relevant to the kind of times we're living in, where we're just all so isolated and kind of, you know, frenetic and disenfranchised, is you know, along your style of just being very appreciative, you know, when you, I think it was Nick and Mika's house, when you almost equated like how their lifestyle just being they just were incredibly passionately in love, but the way that their houses were structured was almost like a trail, and that there was no doors or
Yep,
unnecessary
that's a
obstruction.
great point. It really was.
It just flowed, right? And you know, and I kind of, for some reason, I kind of equated this to a quote. I don't remember who said this in the book, but I think you said it. You said, how change is sad, but failure to change when change is called for is sadder still. And, you know, we've all kind of gotten used to living in a certain way. We've got our patterns. And, you know, what was cool about this is, you know, you're an outdoors guy and you're kind of sort of an adventurer, but you're not a professional explorer. Like you're a guy that had this idea. You grew up skiing in New Hampshire, and you just stuck a pair of skis on your feet. And of course, there's some training, and I'm sure you had some skills, but you just went for it, you know. And the Sefra's whole kind of focus is we don't have to go to the Himalayas to expedition. We can, you know, explore in our own backyard. And I think there's a tremendous amount of power and, you know, in poignancy and lessons we can learn from putting ourselves outside of that comfort zone. And you talk about how you want to do something that was just hard enough to really push yourself, but so you could still appreciate the softer sides of life. And, you know, I wonder if you could speak to the importance of people, you know, I know it sounds kind of cheesy, but just taking a tiny step outside of their comfort zone and adventuring and what they might take from that.
Yeah, so there was a lot in that, in the build up to that question.
Sorry.
No, it was great. I just want to try to like touch on all the points. But I think I'm going to get to go into the kind of the background, the motivations for this journey to begin answering that question. So, you know, my approach to cross-country skiing, and you said this is kind of, it's pretty low key, I guess. I'm not an particularly athletic person, and I don't ski like at the Nordic Center in prepared tracks. I mean, I have, but it's not my habit. Usually it's just a way of kind of getting out and exploring around home. But kind of a hero of mine in earlier days, or still in some way, is the Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen. And I talk every now and then about various Norwegian explorers, just because people who've explored on skis are often Norwegians. But Fridtjof Nansen was this great explorer. You know, he was the first person to cross the Greenland ice cap, which he did on skis. He came closer than anyone had come before him to the North Pole on skis. But when he was at home in Norway, like, he wasn't like this athletic skier. It was just kind of the winter version of walking for him. And the story that I always loved from a biography that I'd read of Nansen was that at one point when he was a university student, he grew up in Oslo, on the eastern side of Norway, but he went to university in Bergen on the west coast, and they're about 300 miles apart. And there's a mountain range in between them. Not big mountains, but pretty, like kind of like New Hampshire, the White Mountains. And at least once, I remember reading, he when the winter holidays came around at the university, like all his friends who were from Oslo got on the train and went home to Oslo. And Nansen one day was, you know, and it was like this kind of last minute decision, as I remember. He was just kind of like, oh, I'm just gonna put my skis on, throw some food in my backpack, and ski back to Oslo. 300. That'd be like if I skied down to the Pequot Library from Littleton just to talk to you guys. And I always like, there wasn't a lot in this biography about the journey itself, but I kind of imagined him like skiing into this little village, you know, coming into you know, walking up to someone's house and like buying a piece of sausage or something, munching on, going and sleeping in the snow cave, and then going on. So that was kind of like my inspiration for the journey, really, that idea. And I just, in general, I just love this idea of, even if we live in places that are not wild anymore, and we don't, kind of like sort of imagining away all this dross around us, you know, and like treating you, because we're fortunate in New England, we have, like, even though it's fairly densely populated, we have like pretty big chunks of woods where you can go into, immerse yourself in them, and like imagine away all the crap that surrounds us, and like, you know, pretend you're Nansen crossing Greenland, you know. Like, I can go out and ski in New Hampshire near my home, and not see people for hours and like feel like I'm on some great expedition. And when you do that, you notice things that you don't otherwise notice, which is the whole point, at least one point of it.
I started leading the Botanical Expeditions, where we say we're not botanists, we're botanists, and we take ecotypic or truly local native plants, and we paddle along riparian corridors along rivers. And even on the Connecticut River this past year, we used Polynesian outrigger canoes, and you really don't see that many people on the river. And we went through Hartford, and you're going through even like these big city areas, but it's amazing that we should really utilize our wilderness spaces right in our own backyards. And then as caretakers, we don't just want to take the beauty and take the experience. You want to give back. You want to help steward the land. And so I think there's so much reciprocity that comes along with deep nature connection and wanting to make sure that these wilderness corridors last forever. And whether that's through planting seeds or writing and inspiring people or training people, how to actually go out and do it safely. It all really plays a role to just, get outside, folks, have an adventure of your own, right? I mean,
Yep.
That's what's important.
The rivers are a great example, now that you mention it, of like these little these pockets of like mini wilderness that we don't notice. I mean, like how many people, pretty much any river. I mean, Connecticut is, right, it flows past my town here. I mean, it's a different Connecticut from down there, but still.
We paddled up from New Hampshire last season.
So, I'm sorry?
We paddled the New Hampshire section from the John Ledyard Canoe Club last season at Dartmouth.
Well, I have paddled the upper section from Francis to the John Ledyard Canoe Club.
That sounds gorgeous. Yeah. That's the gorgeous.
No. So I know, but so that your example really, I mean, is familiar and resonates with me. And there's this sense of you hear like cars in the distance and they're really close to you, but no one is looking down in the river. And it's like, this is a little world unto itself. But there are other places like that too, and tucked in, even in deepest suburbia.
I think it's, if people who haven't read this book, and I'm curious if people have read it, they share similar sentiments, but I think that's it's really powerful medicine, and I'll use that term kind of loosely, but people don't have to go ski across Canada, right? And there's all these books like, nature deficit disorder. Mm-hmm. It's really it's hard to find your center these days, right? Everyone's kind of struggling in their own way, isolation, what have you. And there's so many encounters that you had that people could have if they literally, in Southport, if they went up to like, Easton or Reading or close towns and just spent a day kind of walking around in an area a bit unfamiliar to them.
No, go ahead.
I think it's just, what I really appreciate about the story, and every element, whether you're, in the towns or on the lake bed and the snowmobilers coming to check on you, or the loggers, or, all these different, components, is that you were almost a stranger in a strange land, right? And you, by being that visitor, you automatically broke through every single cultural barrier, perception, and you just kind of connect with people on a very different level. And I think that's a very like refreshing, rewarding experience to have. And I'm curious, and I think it's easier to have when you're very much out of your zone. But I think you can get that, as Sefra just described, not far from home.
No, that's great. And so they're by doing, going off and looking for these little sort of pockets of mini wilderness or imaginary wilderness, like we were talking, like Sefra and I were talking about a minute ago. It's great, and you can connect with the natural world that way, which is fantastic. But then there's this other part of it, the human part that you're talking about. I love that. I like your phrase, the stranger in a strange land. And the thing is, you can be, by being strange, doing strange things, you can be a stranger in a strange land in, where you live. Like, and because this is a lot of people who've read the book say, oh, you met all these people who are so generous and like, connected with these people just, immediately after meeting with them. And, that would never happen here because either I was in this wilderness and so vulnerable, and that's why people were nice to me, or because Canadians are nicer than Americans or whatever. But I can say from personal experience that that's not, I mean, that may have a little bit to do with it, but I think if you just go out and do unusual things, like go walk along the side of the road and plant flowers, for example, other people will be like, oh, that person's doing something strange. I'm going to go talk to them and find out what they're doing. And then if people are, I mean, even the most jaded people they're like, some part of them is inspired by that kind of thing. And that becomes a connection. And yeah, it's great. And I'm not just, this isn't hypothetical. I mean, this is something that I've experienced. I've done shorter journeys than this one, and close to home, like around New England and in the Adirondacks and beyond, like in northern New York in general. They're doing strange things like walking along the side of a road, rather than, you know, in the Adirondack Park or something like that. And I've had experiences just like this, you know, people inviting me to spend a night in their home, which I, you know, might not have expected, but it's not just something that happens in remote places or in places where people are known for their friendliness. It can happen. I think it can happen anywhere.
And that has been one thing that I've been a bit crestfallen thinking about COVID's effect. We don't have to go there now, but on that facet of traveling, how it just always used to be such a open arms. But a question for you, and I don't know if you covered this in your book or not, but are you the first documented person to have done that? To have solo cross-country skied in?
Is that like wait, what did I do exactly? You know, like I think to have the terms of comparison, I would have to have like a, you know,
the Aboriginal.
Spend an entire winter out traveling across Canada, mostly on skis. I mean, to have done exactly what I did, certainly. I don't know what, I mean, there are other, I think someone's gone across, like, kind of from, basically from kind of the Yukon, Alaska line to like Hudson's Bay, something like that, on a dog sled. Like there have been journeys like that have been done, I think. But what I wanted to do, and I say something about this in the book, like most expeditions of this kind that are done on skis or dog sleds, like tend to be done in areas that are either uninhabited or, for all intents and purposes, uninhabited, like in the Arctic or like the high tundra, where there, you know, there are very few people. There are people, but like statistically, there are no people. But I wanted to again, like I talk about the boreal forest as, in my mind, kind of this area where true wilderness and civilization kind of meet to negotiate their differences. And I was interested in exploring that area on skis, you know, using this instrument that we associate with more extreme places. I mean, insofar as we think of it as a means of transportation. And so I think that was unique. I don't know that anyone else has done just that.
I just think, like, do you have a community of fellows or colleagues that you can, you know, I mean, do you change what temperature do you keep your house at, right? Are you just perennially hot now and try to sleep inside?
Actually, no, I get cold.
Starting a plant off, like, how do you bring it back into the greenhouse? You know what I mean?
No.
What was the transition back like, you know?
Yeah, the transition back was kind of, I was thinking about this because someone asked me that recently for the first time. And it was actually, but there was quite an abrupt reaction. Like one of the first night that I spent, as you know, I read the book, it's not like I spent 4 months without ever sleeping under a roof. You know, I'd meet people and they would invite me in and spend a night in their place and warm up and dry off, like pretty frequently, probably, you know, every 10 or 12 days that would happen. But still, you know, I was used to being outside and like working hard all the time and, you know, to survive. And so something happens, I think, psychologically. Like your brain is somehow your body knows that it can't let its guard down. But then as soon as I had left the trail, the first night, so you know, the book ends, I think with my father joins me for the last 3 days on the trail, and then we drove back east together. And like the first night we left the trail, we drove down to Winnipeg and spent the night in a hotel. And so at that point, my brain knew that I wasn't going to be going back to live, you know, out on the trail. And my whole body just went into like meltdown. And I won't go into the graphic details, but it was not a pleasant experience. I just got like violently sick. Think of like food poisoning multiplied by, you know, 10. And I've heard this from other people who have done like long expeditions like this, that, you know, your brain sends a signal that, you know, your immune system kind of needs to go into overdrive and it's working really hard. But then as soon as it knows that it doesn't need to be doing that anymore, because you've finished doing what you're going to do, like all of the sicknesses that you might have had in the course of a normal winter kind of like pile on all at once. So that happened like literally the first night that I left the trail. And then after that, as far as readjusting society goes, I went through this period of kind of aimless wandering. You know, I was still very much had this sense of crisis from the fact that my marriage had gone into this downward spiral and I didn't really know what I was going to do next. And so I ended up spending that following like spring and summer and fall working on this organic farm on the north shore of Lake Superior and living in this little cabin off the grid. And that was in some ways kind of like an easing out of the experience, because it wasn't so different. Like winter was still kind of hanging on as I moved into that place. And so it was still sort of a bit of a fight for survival. But the one interesting kind of lasting effect that persisted for more than just a couple of months was that, like, because just every minute of that winter was so like just unimaginably hard work. It was like just think of like working really hard on something, and then think of like being in that mode kind of around the clock for 4 months. That's what it was like being out there. Because, you know, you can't, until I was in my sleeping bag every night, you couldn't stop just to kind of keep myself warm. And so when I returned to normal life and, you know, working and, you know, just doing like going through the daily grind, everything just seemed like ridiculously easy to me. I was like, are you kidding me? Like, I mean, everything, whether it was a physical task or a mental task, it was all just like, it felt like it required zero energy. And that lasted for probably like a year and a half. And unfortunately, it has since worn off, because it was kind of nice.
It sounds like when I would talk to my brother when he would be doing disaster relief work, you know, after like day 4 of staying up straight, trying to recover folks, whether it be in Haiti or something, you kind of have to tell the system to take a rest. But
what was cool though is like you talk about it in the book. You say, you know, it's amazing. You know, you're in like 1 or 2 hairy situations where, like, you know, you made like this like kind of off the cuff comment of like, you know, all you got to do is just keep walking, you know, and like, you know, eventually you're going to come to a safe place. And, you know, it's like amazing what people are capable of if they just keep walking, right? And that's a pretty profound statement, because you know, you stay warm and you just keep 1 foot in front of the other, and you knew you were going to be okay. And of course, you put yourself in a situation where, you know, if you let your guard down, like, you know, there were some real repercussions and potential consequences, which I think are important if you're really going to have some kind of growth. But I think it was really cool, you know, how you articulated that very simply. And just to riff off of that, you do a lot of work with the veteran community, especially like special operations guys. And, you know, as entrepreneurs, you know, they come back and articulate the same thing. They're like, what are you also stressed out about? Like, we can't make payroll. No one's shooting at us. Like, we're not getting blown up. Like, life is good, you know.
Similar kind of.
So folks who have been through these things, you know, they have a different baseline perspective of life, which lasts varying times depending on how extreme it was.
Yeah. No, that's a good comparison. I mean, I'm sure that's more traumatic, of course, than than when I was, but physically, probably not so different.
One thing I want to
Just keep walking. Yeah, no, I think that, sorry to interrupt, but just to say a final thing on that. And I realize that that's one of those statements. It's an oversimplification. Like there are things that are like bigger than us that can actually grind us down, kill us. But I think that most of the time, that is true. It's just, keep walking.
Yeah, I think it's a true testament to grit and resiliency. And I think human beings, from my work with Spartan race, these obstacle course races, seeing what people can actually go through and actually handle, and how cold they can be and how tired they can be and how long you can go without food. And we're getting pretty comfortable being comfortable. And, humanity is pretty used to being comfortable, being uncomfortable. And there's some sort of a fine line in there, friends, of like where health meets our current reality. And that's being a little bit uncomfortable sometimes. But with just like 9 or so minutes left, I encourage any of the participants out there, if you have any questions for Anders, just put them in the chat. I do see one from Robert who says, have you ever done anything with AMC? I worked in the huts many years ago.
What was the name, Robert?
Yes.
Thank you, Robert, for the question. So I live in Littleton, and just in the western White Mountains. And so have I ever done anything with AMC? I use lots of AMC trails. I've sometimes have joined trail crews to work on trails. And I pop into the huts and in the Pinkham Notch and Highland centers and whatnot. But I'm not like don't really actively do a lot with the AMC. But that's great. Hot crews, fantastic. I have some friends who've done that.
All right. Well, I don't see any more for now, but.
Right. But to your comment about not letting ourselves get too comfortable, amen to that, Sefra. I think Jesse mentioned, I think early on this, the people living in these little simple houses that were like in the wilderness, that weren't an affront to the wilderness. And that kind of, to me, was an example of that ideal, like trying, and we think, obviously we don't all live in the wilderness, but trying to have some level of discomfort, which is, it's a negative word, but built into our everyday existence. It helps in all kinds of ways. It makes us tougher for one thing, but it also helps us to appreciate, the things that the comforts that we do have. Like it makes them, we savor them more.
I think Sefra calls that obstacle immunity.
There you go.
We have one from Marilyn Jew. We are curious as to what your major was in Scotland.
It was ancient history.
Ooh, that's a good one.
It was kind of lame. I studied history as an undergraduate, like modern history, which is I'm really more interested in. But I went through this sort of phase where I was more interested in ancient history, and so that's what I did.
We can learn quite a bit from those ancient civilizations. Are there any other expeditions on the horizons, Maria?
Yeah, lots of the smaller kind that we were talking about. But one thing, a slightly bigger one, kind of a mid-size between, the little everyday expeditions and the one that I talk about in this book. Another thing I'd like to do, and maybe probably write about it, but differently from the way that I've written this book. I would like to go on a long walk in a warmer season, like late summer or early fall, that is taken entirely between the hours of sunset and sunrise. So I want to make myself nocturnal, without a light or anything like, no light alarm. And then the journey, but in this case, like I envision the book that I would like to write about would just be kind of a thread that connects chapters that look at night, what night means to us. So like the culture of night, the ecology of night, and just write about night. And in the end, and so it's just all kind of unified with this experiment of me making myself nocturnal. And so it's not a book, it wouldn't be a travel book in the way that this one is.
That's like, who was it? I think, I can't think of the author, but one of the great naturalists, when he first saw like the glowing moss and these different mushrooms, these like in the mycological realm, you start to see everything that's active at night, which, yeah, from an ecological point of view, when people talk about ecology, we sometimes are just thinking about it like from the biodiversity, right? How biodiverse the boreal forests are, but there's also the audio ecological perspective, right? So it's like the sounds that you hear. And one of the ways that we know that we have a healthy landscape is if we hear all these songbirds out here, right? And so you think about kind of the soundtrack of diurnal or like during the day, and then you can think about it, what it is at night and how exquisite must that be.
Yeah, and then another thing is like another thing to think about ecologically is the importance of times of day. Like we hear a lot about animals ranges shifting because of climate change or the encroachment of human beings, like their physical ranges, but then their ranges also shift in terms of time. So there's this phenomenon of nocturnal animals becoming nocturnal that haven't been nocturnal for all of history, just because like that's a way they can live among humans by going out at times of day when humans aren't out.
Trails are adapting. Hey, I don't want to interrupt, but I know there's a bunch of questions in the Q&A section here.
Oh, someone says I need major hazard pay for presumably for my nighttime expedition.
Just phosphorescence.
Christine, did you want us to read through these, or?
Yeah, I can read through them. So I see we have a question from Lawrence. He writes, Anders, did you think you would write a book when you were, I guess, taking this trip? Were you journaling during the trip? And how long after completion of the trip did the book start?
All right, I'll take those. I'll try to do those in order. So I was thinking of writing a book before I went, but I think that the book, whatever book I imagined was very different from the book that I ended up writing, just because of kind of the turn of events in my personal life. And then the journal question, yes, I kept a very thorough diary. So every evening I would cook in my tent in my vestibule, which you're not supposed to do, by the way, but I wasn't going to cook outside. And then I would have to spend between 2 and 3 hours sitting there with my camp stove, melting snow and ice into water for the next 24 hours consumption. And so I would melt the snow into water and then boil it and then pour it into my thermos, and like load after load like that. And it was while I was sitting there, the cook stove would warm the vestibule up a little bit, a few degrees, and I'd have this big parka on and in my sleeping bag over my lap and whatnot. Anyway, so it was while I was waiting for that I would scribble in my diary for like a couple of hours every night. So there was a lot of material. And then how long did it take me to write the book? It took me a while. Actually, I wrote a first draft the following winter, so pretty quickly, and I just kind of cranked it out in maybe 3 or 4 months. But it was just a linear, basically, account of the physical journey itself, and it was kind of flat. It read flat to me, and so I put it in a drawer, my desk drawer, and left it for a few years because it felt like it just was kind of there, and there was no trajectory. It didn't have a satisfying ending. And what needed to happen was I needed to find a sense of ending. And so events, I mentioned early in the talk that when I left the trail, actually when I hit the trail, I was all but certain that my marriage was done. And by the time I left it, I was like 99.99% certain, that it was just a matter of like getting my divorce paperwork done. But then over, 5 years passed, and I did lots of kind of stupid and silly things along the way. But eventually I realized that, I still felt in love with my wife. she somehow still felt the same way about me, even though I, treated her like a piece of garbage. And we eventually got back together. And it was only after that had happened, like so many things kind of came into this focus that I hadn't seen before. And that really helped me to find a cohesive arc for the story.
The succession of the experience, right? The forest goes into succession.
Yes.
It goes into succession. Yeah. It's beautiful. It's such a testament to the wilderness. And I'm sure you have so many just images and smells seared into your being from being out on the land.
So we do have one other question. Oh, I'm sorry, Anders, were you going to say something else?
No, that's okay.
I do see we have one other question. So was there a point where you ever felt the trip was a mistake? Did you feel it was too extreme or like you were prepared?
Along the way, never really quite. I mean, there were certainly moments where there were a few points, not as many as you might expect, but there were a few points where I had the thought that, if I had some easy way of leaving the trail right now, I would. But in retrospect, fortunately, when that thought did occur to me, that it wasn't an option. And so I did get through it. But as to the first question of whether I thought it was a mistake, afterwards there was that period that I just described between like the end of the journey and I was kind of in this it wasn't like life was miserable. I don't have a depressive personality. Like I'm able to find nice things even when I'm on the whole things aren't great. But there were moments when and sometimes it was connected to the book, the fact that I'd written this manuscript and that it was just completely unsatisfying to me. And I thought, I just wasted my time. I've ruined my marriage. And I'm still in love with my old wife, but I don't want to move back to Italy. And so I'm like, what have I done here? But it was actually the experience of writing the book brought everything together. And like I just said a minute ago, everything kind of came into focus. And so that gave the journey. Not that all the little things along the way in the journey had no meaning, but like that gave the journey as a whole this sense of meaning. And then, it kind of put my life back together in a way. And sorry, at this point I'm rambling. I'm just going to stop talking.
Oh, it was like a cathartic experience. Sorry.
No, it makes sense. I mean, in a traditional vision quest, if I may, within this context, right? When you have a rites of passage and you go out into the wilderness, there's 4 days of preparation. There's 4 days where you just sit out on the land. And then there's 4 days of what's called like integration and mirroring, right? Before you really realize and understand the lessons in the profound nature of the rite of passage that you just went through, you have to take that time to like share and tell your story and then have it mirrored back to you by elders and people that can give proper feedback, like certainly within that context. So it's normal that there's a period of digestion, right?
Yeah.
And then sharing, and then in the reflection it's still the expedition, right? I feel like that's something that never ends. It's now just cohesively a part of the being that is Anders Morley, right?
No, it's true. And I'm glad that's great. Like you see how fantastic human traditions are. Like humans are pretty smart. They figured out some great stuff. Like, how that just shows an incredible understanding of human psychology, and that it's not like just something that's invented from one day to the next.
Journal, sit spot, right? There's some basic tenets that are taught by, there's some easy things that we can all.
That plays really, I think there's one more question in there. I don't know if you see that plays really well on this question. I don't know if you see that. I can read it if you'd like.
Yeah, go for
it. It's from Anne. You may see this as a tangent, but handling loss, like your separation, is something harder than handling external hardships.
When we think about it, handling loss is harder than handling external hardships. Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, it's certainly more complicated. You know, it requires a more, I guess, like sophisticated toolbox. You can't just chart. Actually, there is something I say in the last chapter. I'm not going to be as articulate talk about it. I'm going to find the passage with it that kind of, I think, is connected to that point in some way. Bear with me for just a second here. All right, so I write this is in the last chapter where I kind of tie up the loose ends. And I've taught in this chapter is kind of like not really in the same time frame as the narrative of the journey itself. It's obviously written years later. To stay alive in the wilderness in winter, you have to move as fast as possible. When you're alive, you know, there's that famous, I think, Mark Twain quote about, like, if you're going through hell, keep going. And so when you talk about physical hardships, I think that's true. But when it comes to loss, for example, that becomes harder to deal with. So to stay alive in the wilderness in winter, you have to move as fast as possible. When you're lost in the wilderness of human living, on the other hand, you must move slowly and deliberately to find your way again. It seems to follow that spending a winter traveling across northern Canada is a bad way of dealing with a midlife crisis. But looking at the ecology of winter, I begin to think that maybe this isn't quite true. Animals huddled in their dens during a February blizzard probably think, in whatever way they can, that winter is an awful strategy for making them stronger. Why all this added pressure? Can't you see we're already trying to make it through a dearth? Surely evolution and the seasons could have agreed on something more pleasant than this deranged game of do or die. But apparently they could not. To get through the seasonal crisis, you have to make your mind go as fast as your body must go and hope that it works as well as it does when it has a little more slack. So I'll leave it at that.
Cool beans.
Other questions or?
I think the last question that just came in is just a thank you from Lawrence. It says, thank you, great discussion, so thoughtful, and congratulations on a rejuvenated, stronger marriage.
Thanks very much. That's nice. And thanks to everyone out there for coming this evening and listening to our talk. I hope it was interesting for you. I've enjoyed myself. Thanks, guys, Jesse and Sefra, and thanks to you, Christine, and to the Pequot Library and the friends of the Pequot Library.
Thank you. Everyone. Thanks, Anders, and thank you, Jesse and Sefra, and thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Yep, it was such a pleasure, and I hope you all ski through this book because it is just a delicious world to enter into. Anders, such a pleasure.
Thanks.
I know I'm cheesy. What can I do?
That's all right.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Have
you
a good
all.
night.